Hey, hey, it's okay. Don't cry. I'm here. Annie said it fast, almost breathless, the moment she saw him. Lucas Hartman was sitting on the floor near the window, his back against the wall, knees pulled tight to his chest. His small hands were wrapped around a photograph, bent at the corners from being held too often, too tightly. Tears slid down his cheeks without sound, dropping onto the floor like he didn't want anyone to notice. Annie's heart jumped into her throat. She knew who he was. Everyone in the house did. The billionaire's son. The boy who had lost his mother 2 months ago. The boy no one could reach. The boy who didn't speak anymore. Annie wasn't supposed to be here. She was just waiting for her mother to finish work. She was supposed to sit quietly, stay out of sight, stay out of trouble. That was the rule for kids like her. But Lucas was crying, and he was crying the kind of cry Annie understood, the quiet kind that came when you thought nobody was coming for you. She hurried over and dropped down onto the floor beside him, close enough to matter but not so close that she scared him. Her voice came out soft, shaky with urgency. "It's okay," she repeated. "You're not alone. Everyone's still here." Lucas didn't look at her. His fingers clenched even harder around the photograph. "No," he whispered. "They're not. She's gone, too." Annie swallowed. She glanced at the picture and saw the woman's smile, wide and warm. Her face pressed close to Lucas's. His mom. Annie felt a familiar ache in her chest, the kind that came from seeing someone else's pain and recognizing it. "She's not here like before," Annie said carefully. "But you still have people. Your dad. The people in the house. They're around you all the time." Lucas shook his head, small and sharp. "They don't understand." Annie nodded right away. Grown-ups mess that up sometimes. That made him pause. Annie shifted her legs and sat cross-legged, making herself comfortable, like she wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. "When my grandma went away," she said, choosing her words slowly, "everyone kept telling me to be strong. I didn't want to be strong. I just wanted someone to sit with me." Lucas sniffed. His shoulders relaxed just a little. "So I sit with you," Annie added simply. "That's allowed." "Never." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper she'd folded and unfolded so many times it was already soft. Without asking, without explaining, she started folding it again. Her fingers moved quickly, confidently, as if they'd done this 100 times before. Lucas watched from the corner of his eye. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice thin but curious. "Making something," Annie said. "My mom says when your hands are busy, your head doesn't hurt as much." "I will." She finished the last fold and held the paper up. It was a little dog, lopsided ears and all. She smiled at it like it was perfect. "It looks funny," Lucas said quietly. Annie grinned. "That's because I'm not very good yet." That earned a tiny sound from him, not quite a laugh, but close. The crying slowed, his breathing evening out as he leaned forward to look at the paper dog more closely. "Do you want to try?" Annie asked. He hesitated, then nodded. She handed him another piece of paper and guided his hands, slow and patient. "Fold here. Press there. Turn it around." When he messed up, she didn't correct him right away. She just waited. "That's okay," she said when he frowned. "It doesn't have to be perfect." Lucas stared at his crooked folds. "My mom said that too." Annie looked up at him. Then she was right. They sat there folding paper, the silence between them no longer heavy, just quiet. Annie made another shape, a boat this time, and slid it across the floor. "We can pretend it's going somewhere," she said. "Where?" Lucas asked. "Anywhere you want." He thought for a moment. "To my mom," Annie nodded. "She'd like that." Lucas lined the paper boat up with the window and gently pushed it forward like it was floating on water. He watched it for a long time. "I miss her all the time," he said. "Even when I'm not crying." Annie understood that feeling too well. "Missing doesn't go away fast," she said. "But it changes. Sometimes it gets quieter." Lucas hugged the photograph to his chest again, but not as tightly this time. "Do you think she knows I'm still thinking about her?" "I do," Annie said without hesitation. "I think moms know things like that." He looked at her, really looked at her. his red eyes searching her face. "You won't tell anyone," I cried, "right?" Annie shook her head. "No. Crying just means you loved her." Lucas let out a breath that sounded like relief. He scooted a little closer to Annie, their shoulders almost touching. "Can we play again tomorrow?" he asked. Annie's heart lifted. "Yeah, I can come if my mom brings me." A few minutes later, Lucas picked up a crayon from the small table nearby and started drawing on the back of the paper. Annie leaned in to see. "It's me and her," he said, pointing. "And this is you." Annie blinked. "That's me?" "Yeah, you're here." Somewhere down the hallway. William Hartman stood still, having stopped when he heard his son's voice clearer than it had been in weeks. He didn't move closer. He didn't speak. He just watched as his son sat on the floor with a little girl. Paper scattered around them. His posture open, his face calmer than William had seen since before the funeral. Lucas was talking. Not much, but enough. On the floor, Annie gently nudged another folded shape toward him. "See?" she said softly. "You're not by yourself. People are still around you. Sometimes you just have to let them sit with you." Lucas nodded, his fingers tracing the lines of his drawing. For the first time in a long while, the heaviness in his chest eased. Not gone, just lighter. And for now, that was enough. William Hartman noticed the change before he allowed himself to believe it. It came in fragments, small enough that anyone else might have dismissed them as coincidence. A pause that didn't happen. A silence that ended sooner than expected. A routine that bent, just slightly, out of its rigid shape. At breakfast, Lucas sat in his chair without being carried. That alone made William stop mid-motion, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. For weeks, his son had needed coaxing just to enter the room. This morning, Lucas climbed up on his own, dragging the chair back with effort, his small face set in concentration. He didn't look at his father, but he didn't turn away either. William sat down slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might send the moment fleeing. The oatmeal arrived, warm and untouched, like it always did. William waited for the familiar sequence, Lucas staring into the bowl, spoon resting beside it. The quiet withdrawal. Instead, Lucas picked up the spoon. He didn't rush, he didn't eat much, but he ate, one bite, then another. William kept his eyes on the rim of his mug. He had learned that staring was its own kind of pressure. Still, his chest tightened as if something fragile were stretching inside him. "Good morning," he said finally, keeping his voice even. Lucas nodded, just nodded. It wasn't conversation. It wasn't healing, but it was presence. Later that morning, as William crossed the hallway outside his son's room, he heard something unfamiliar. Not crying, not the heavy silence that had haunted the house since the funeral. It was the sound of paper, soft creases, the faint rasp of folding. William slowed his steps and stopped just short of the open doorway. Inside, Lucas sat on the floor with papers scattered around him. He was focused, his brow slightly furrowed, his hands busy. His shoulders were relaxed. He was not alone. A small black girl sat across from him, legs crossed, her posture calm and grounded. She wasn't talking much. She didn't hover. She simply mirrored his pace, folding when he folded, waiting when he hesitated. William felt a sharp pull behind his ribs. This was not how Lucas behaved with anyone else. Doctors had tried. Therapists had tried. Family friends had tried. Even William, desperate and careful, had tried everything short of begging. Every attempt had ended the same way, with Lucas retreating further into himself, his grief tightening like a locked door. And yet here he was, present, engaged, alive. William leaned against the wall, unseen, his heart beating louder than he liked. He told himself to analyze it the way he analyzed everything else. Identify variables, assess risk, measure outcomes. But this wasn't a market shift. This was his child. Lucas lifted his head suddenly. "It's crooked," he said, holding up a folded shape. The girl smiled. "That's okay. Crooked things still work." Lucas considered this, then smiled back. Not wide, not carefree, but real. William closed his eyes for a second. That smile had been gone for 2 months. "If this moment touched your heart, Take a second to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can find you when you need them most. Throughout the day, the pattern continued. Lucas didn't withdraw after lunch. He sat at the window and drew on scrap paper instead of curling into himself. When Mrs. Caldwell passed by and greeted him softly, he didn't flinch. He didn't answer, but he didn't recoil either. In the afternoon, when a nurse arrived to check on him, Lucas allowed her to sit nearby. He kept his eyes on his paper, his fingers brushing the folded shapes beside him. But he stayed. William watched from his office, the security feed muted, his gaze fixed not on screens or numbers, but on his son's small figure. The change was subtle, but it was unmistakable. Lucas was still grieving, still sad, still fragile, but the sharp edge of his despair had softened. That evening, when William finally gathered the courage to speak to him, he did it carefully. "I saw you folding paper today," he said as they sat in the living room, the fire crackling quietly. "It looked nice." Lucas glanced at him, then back at the floor. "Annie showed me." William nodded, filing the name away like something precious. "She seems kind." "She is," Lucas said. After a pause, he added, "She says people don't leave all at once." The words landed heavier than William expected. He swallowed. "What do you think about that?" Lucas hugged his knees, thinking, "I think sometimes they stay in different ways." William felt his throat tighten. He reached out, then stopped himself, afraid of pushing too far. "I'm glad you're not alone," he said instead. Lucas didn't answer, but he didn't get up and leave. That night, after Lucas was asleep, William stood by the door longer than necessary, listening to the steady rhythm of his son's breathing. It was deeper than it had been in weeks, less broken. Downstairs, he poured himself a drink he didn't finish and sat in the darkened living room, replaying the day in his mind. The smile, the calm, the way Lucas's body leaned toward the little girl instead of folding inward. William had built his life on control, on influence, on solutions that could be bought, negotiated, enforced. He had always believed that if something was broken badly enough, it required something equally powerful to fix it. And yet his son's first real step back from the edge had come from a child with no title, no authority, no plan, just presence, just patience, just staying. William leaned back and stared at the ceiling, the weight of understanding settling slowly over him. He didn't yet know what he would do, but he knew this. Whatever was helping his son could not be ignored, dismissed, or treated as an inconvenience. Not again. It followed Lucas like a quiet shadow. Subtle but consistent. The boy still woke up early, still clutched his mother's photograph before breakfast, still moved through the house as if it were a place he did not entirely trust. But there were pauses now, moments where the sadness loosened its grip long enough for something else to slip through. Curiosity. William noticed it in the way Lucas lingered by the window instead of retreating to his room, in the way he followed the sound of footsteps rather than shrinking from them, in the way his eyes tracked movement, not with fear, but with interest. And always, when Annie was near, Lucas was different. That afternoon, William found himself working from the study with the door half open, an old habit from years when he wanted to hear the house breathe. He told himself he was reviewing documents. In truth, he was listening. He heard Lucas's voice first, not loud, not excited, but present. "You did it wrong," Lucas said. Annie laughed softly. "I know, I always do." William looked up. Through the doorway, he saw them sitting on the rug near the fireplace. Paper was scattered everywhere, folded shapes, torn corners, half-finished attempts. Annie sat cross-legged, calm and steady. Lucas leaned forward, his body open, his hands moving freely. "You're supposed to fold it this way," Lucas continued, demonstrating with careful precision. Annie watched him closely. "Oh," she said, exaggerated seriousness in her voice. "You're right. You're better at this than me." Lucas's mouth twitched. Then, unmistakably, he smiled. William felt his chest tighten so suddenly he had to grip the arm of his chair. That smile wasn't the fragile flicker he'd seen the day before. It was small, but it stayed. It changed Lucas's entire face, softening the tension that had lived there since the hospital room, since the moment his mother's hand had gone still. William had seen that smile once before on a beach years ago, When Lucas had been 3 and fearless and running straight into the waves, he hadn't thought he would see it again. Annie slid a folded shape toward Lucas. What should this one be? Lucas studied it. A house. Annie nodded. Okay, what kind of house? Lucas thought for a moment. One where nobody has to leave. The words were simple, the meaning was not. William turned his gaze away, blinking hard. He had spent his adult life training himself not to react, not to let emotion interfere with judgment. But this was not a negotiation. This was his child, quietly telling the truth in the only way he could. Later that evening, William joined them. He didn't sit down right away. He stood near the edge of the room, careful not to intrude, watching as Lucas showed Annie how to flatten a fold. Annie exaggerated her clumsiness, letting Lucas correct her. It was a subtle exchange of power, one William recognized instinctively. She was giving his son something he had lost. Control. Lucas, William said gently. Lucas looked up. His body stiffened for a fraction of a second, an old reflex, but it passed. Yes, he answered. William almost missed it. Almost. I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner a little earlier tonight, William said. You can bring your paper things with you. Lucas glanced at Annie. She shrugged. I eat early, she said. It's not that exciting. Lucas nodded. Okay. William exhaled slowly. At the table, Lucas ate more than he had in weeks. Not because he was hungry, William knew grief stole hunger first, but because he was calm. Annie sat 2 chairs away, swinging her legs, talking about school, about a teacher who smelled like peppermint, about a dog she saw every morning on the bus route. Lucas listened. When he finished eating, he pushed his plate away and looked at his father. Annie says writing helps. William straightened. Does it? Lucas nodded. When things feel too big. William hesitated, then said carefully, Would you like me to get you a notebook? Lucas considered this. Can Annie help me? William didn't answer right away. He looked at the small girl across the table, the child who had walked into his house without permission and done what his wealth, his influence, his authority had failed to do. Yes, he said finally, if she wants to. Annie smiled, shy but proud. That night, Lucas slept without waking from a nightmare for the first time since the funeral. William knew because he checked. He always checked. Standing in the doorway of his son's room, he listened to the steady rise and fall of Lucas's breathing. The photograph lay on the nightstand now, not clutched against his chest. The paper crane rested beside it. William stepped back quietly and closed the door. Downstairs, he poured himself a glass of water and stared out at the darkened garden. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered. Tired. Humbled. For the first time since his wife's death, a dangerous thought crept into his mind. What if I was wrong about what my son needed? Not experts, not strategies, not distance disguised as protection, but presence. The next morning, when Annie didn't arrive right away, Lucas noticed. He stood by the window, scanning the driveway, his fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. She's late, he said. William checked his watch. Your mother's shift sometimes changes, he said carefully. Lucas nodded, but his shoulders rose, tension returning. William knelt beside him. Even if she's not, he added. I'm here. Lucas looked at him, really looked. William didn't look away. The tension eased, just a little. That was when William understood something else, something that unsettled him more than he expected. Annie wasn't just helping Lucas survive his grief. She was teaching him how. And William, watching from the edges, was learning too. The first sign of trouble came quietly, the way most real problems did. It arrived not as a raised voice or an argument, but as a look. Mrs. Caldwell stood near the doorway of the sitting room, her clipboard tucked under one arm, watching Annie and Lucas from a careful distance. Her expression was polite, professional, and tight. The kind of tightness that came when something felt out of place but no one had yet decided what to do about it. William noticed. He had learned, over decades of business, to read rooms the way other people read headlines. Power rarely announced itself. Discomfort rarely complained. They showed up in posture, in silence, in the way people avoided eye contact. Lucas sat on the rug, his legs stretched out, a notebook open in front of him. Annie lay on her stomach beside him, propped up on her elbows, watching as he pressed his pencil down with serious concentration. "What are you writing today?" she asked. Lucas frowned slightly. "I don't know how to spell everything." "That's okay," Annie said. "You don't have to." He glanced up at her. "Then how will she read it?" Annie understood immediately who he meant. "You can draw parts," she said, "and you can write the words you know. The rest, she'll understand." Lucas nodded, satisfied with that answer, and bent back over the page. William felt a familiar ache settle behind his ribs. He had spent weeks wondering what his son was thinking, what fears were circling his small mind at night. Now, here it was, spilling out in crooked letters and uneven lines because someone had given him permission to express it without fixing it. Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Hartman," she said. William turned to her. "Yes?" She hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. "May I have a word?" William followed her into the hallway, closing the door behind them. The murmur of the children's voices faded, replaced by the hush of the corridor. "I don't want to overstep," Mrs. Caldwell began carefully, "but I feel it's my responsibility to raise a concern." William waited. "The little girl," she continued. "Annie, she's been spending quite a lot of time with Lucas." "Yes," William said. "I'm aware." Mrs. Caldwell shifted her weight. "Some of the staff are uncomfortable. It's unconventional. Boundaries matter, especially in a household like this." Was instead, William studied her face. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't malicious. She was doing what institutions always did, protecting structure over substance. "What boundary, exactly, is being crossed?" he asked. Mrs. Caldwell paused. "Well, she's not family." William felt something sharp and unwelcome rise in his chest. "Neither are most of the people who've tried to help my son," he said evenly. "Yet they were allowed." Mrs. Caldwell pressed her lips together. "Of course. But this situation, William interrupted quietly. "Is that my son is speaking again?" That stopped her. "He is eating," William continued. "Sleeping, sitting with other people without panic, for the first time since his mother died." Mrs. Caldwell's expression softened despite herself. "We've noticed the improvement. Then let's not undo it," William said. She nodded slowly. "Of course. I just thought you should be aware." "I am," William replied. "Thank you." End quote. When he returned to the sitting room, Lucas looked up. "Is something wrong?" the boy asked. William crossed the room and sat down in the armchair nearby. "No," he said. "Everything's fine." Lucas seemed to accept this and turned back to his notebook. Annie leaned closer. "What did you write?" Lucas hesitated, then slid the notebook toward her. The page was filled with uneven letters and drawings. A stick figure woman with long hair, a smaller stick figure boy beside her. Above them, the words were shaky but legible. "I miss you. I am trying." Annie felt her throat tighten. "She'd be proud," Annie said quietly. Lucas nodded, his eyes fixed on the page. "Annie?" "Yes?" "Do you think it's bad that I don't cry all the time now?" Annie shook her head right away. "No. Crying all the time hurts." Lucas considered this. "But sometimes I feel okay. And then I feel bad about feeling okay." Annie thought for a moment. This wasn't a question she'd learned from grown-ups. This was something she knew from living. "My mom says feelings can sit next to each other," she said. "Sad doesn't have to leave for okay to come visit." Lucas looked at her, absorbing every word. "So, it's not a trick?" "No," Annie said. "It's just your heart breathing." Across the room, William listened without meaning to. Each sentence landed with more weight than any expert opinion he'd paid for. Later, when Annie's mother came to collect her, Lucas's shoulders slumped. "You're leaving," he said quietly. Annie nodded. "I'll come back tomorrow." Lucas's lip trembled, but he nodded. "Okay." William watched his son walk her to the door. He watched Lucas stand there after she'd gone, holding the notebook to his chest. That night, after Lucas was asleep, William sat alone in his study. The house was silent, but it no longer felt empty in the same way. He replayed the day in his mind, the conversation with Mrs. Caldwell, the notebook, the way Lucas had asked a question he'd been too afraid to ask himself. Is it wrong to feel okay? William thought of his wife, of the guilt that followed every moment he wasn't drowning in grief, of the shame that came with laughter, with distraction, with the smallest sense of relief. He rubbed his face with both hands. Maybe children knew something, adults forgot. The next afternoon, Annie arrived again. Lucas saw her from the window and ran toward the door before stopping himself. Glancing back at his father as if unsure whether this was allowed, William nodded. Lucas didn't hesitate again. As Annie and Lucas settled on the floor, Mrs. Caldwell watched from the doorway, her expression thoughtful now, less rigid. William stood beside her. "She's helping him," Mrs. Caldwell said quietly. "Yes," William replied, "and you're letting it happen." "Rive." William looked at his son, at the boy who had been slipping away from him day by day until a small girl had reached out and simply stayed. "I am," he said, "because sometimes the right thing doesn't look proper." Mrs. Caldwell didn't argue. As the children laughed softly over a paper boat that refused to float straight, William felt a decision forming, not fully shaped yet, but solid enough to matter. This was bigger than comfort. This was something he needed to protect. By the end of the week, the house had adjusted its breathing. That was the only way William Hartman could describe it. The mansion no longer felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The silence was still there, but it had shifted. It no longer pressed down on every room like a weight. It moved now, made space, allowed sound to exist without punishment. Most of that sound came from one place, the sunroom. Lucas sat there most afternoons with Annie, the floor around them slowly filling with paper shapes, pencils, and pages torn from the notebook that had quietly become his most important possession. He still carried his mother's photograph with him, but it no longer lived in his hands every second. Sometimes it rested beside him. Sometimes it stayed on the table while he worked. William noticed everything. He noticed that Lucas no longer flinched when footsteps approached. He noticed that his son began to greet staff with a nod, sometimes even a quiet, "Hi." He noticed that when Annie laughed, Lucas didn't just smile, he joined in, his laughter unsure but real, like a muscle that hadn't been used in a long time. The doctors called it early stabilization. The therapists used words like progress and adaptive coping. William listened politely, nodded at the right moments, signed what needed signing, but he knew the truth. What was happening could not be charted. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the windows, William found himself standing in the doorway of the sunroom again, unseen. Lucas was lying on his stomach, feet kicking idly behind him as he colored. Annie sat beside him, her own page forgotten as she watched him work. "What are you drawing?" she asked. Lucas held up the paper. It showed a house. Not the mansion. A smaller house, with uneven windows and a crooked roof. 3 figures stood in front of it. Annie pointed. "Who's that?" "My mom," Lucas said without hesitation. "That's me. And that's my dad." Annie studied the drawing. "You made him tall." Lucas nodded. "He's always standing up." Annie smiled softly. "Maybe he can sit sometimes." Lucas frowned in thought, then picked up the pencil again and drew a small bench next to the house. He added the 3rd figure sitting down. William felt his throat tighten. That night, at dinner, Lucas surprised him again. "Dad," Lucas said, pushing his peas around his plate. "Yes?" William replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can Annie come to the table tomorrow?" The request was simple. The implication was not. William glanced at Annie, who was seated farther down with her mother, her posture careful, eyes lowered in the way children learned when they understood their place. "Yes," William said immediately. "She can." Annie looked up, startled. Her mother stiffened, unsure. "It's okay," William added gently, meeting the woman's eyes. "If you're comfortable with it." Her mother hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, sir." Lucas exhaled, relief written plainly on his face. That evening, as William tucked his son into bed, Lucas didn't turn away. William sat on the edge of the mattress, hands folded together, unsure of how long he was allowed to stay. "Annie says people don't disappear," Lucas said quietly. William swallowed. "She's right." Lucas turned his head toward him. "You won't disappear, right?" The question landed hard. William had faced hostile takeovers with more composure than he managed in that moment. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "No," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Lucas watched him carefully, as if testing the truth of the words. "Okay," he said at last. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was a beginning. The next day, Annie sat at the table between Lucas and her mother, her feet swinging nervously beneath the chair. The plates were larger than what she was used to, the silverware heavier. Lucas leaned toward her. "You can eat the pancakes," he whispered. "They're good." Annie smiled and nodded. "Okay." William watched as Lucas carefully poured syrup for her, concentrating so hard his tongue peeked out between his teeth. It was such a small act, and yet it carried something enormous with it. "Kari." After breakfast, William made a decision. "Lucas," he said, "would you like to go outside today?" Lucas glanced at Annie. "Can she come?" "Yes," William said again. They walked through the garden slowly, the air cool and clean after the rain. Lucas pointed out the places where he and his mother used to sit. Annie listened without interrupting. When Lucas's voice faltered, she didn't rush to fill the space. She let it be. At the old oak tree, Lucas stopped. "I cried here," he said. Annie nodded. "That's okay. I don't cry as much now," Lucas added, almost guiltily. Annie looked at him seriously. "That just means you're resting." William stood a few steps away, his hands in his pockets, watching the two children beneath the tree. His son was standing upright, his shoulders relaxed, his face open to the world in a way it hadn't been since before the hospital room, before the silence. For the first time, William allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't defined entirely by loss. That night, after Annie and her mother had gone home, William sat alone in the living room, the fire low. He thought about his wife, about the nights she had sat on the floor with Lucas, folding paper animals, laughing at their crooked shapes. He thought about Annie, about how easily she moved through grief without trying to own it or fix it, how she stayed. William realized something then, something that unsettled him deeply. He had been preparing for a recovery. Annie had been teaching his son how to live with the pain. Those were not the same thing. And somewhere between the paper cranes and the quiet conversations, William knew this was only the beginning. The first question William Hartman asked himself that morning was not about his company, his investments, or the meetings stacked neatly across his calendar. It was this: how long can this last? He watched from the kitchen doorway as Lucas sat at the table, swinging his legs, humming softly under his breath. The sound startled him. It was faint, tuneless, but unmistakable. Lucas had not hummed since before the funeral, since before the world had narrowed to a single hospital room and the unbearable stillness that followed. Across from him, Annie was carefully peeling an orange, separating the slices with deliberate care. She handed one to Lucas without looking at him, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Don't eat the white part," Lucas said seriously. "It's bitter." Annie grinned. "I like bitter." Lucas wrinkled his nose. "That's weird." "Maybe," she said, "but I still like it." "Ope." Lucas thought about that for a moment, then shrugged and ate his slice. William felt something loosen in his chest. Later that day, as Annie and her mother prepared to leave, William found himself following them to the back hallway. He wasn't sure what he intended to say. He only knew that letting them walk out without speaking felt wrong. "Miss Johnson," he said quietly. Annie's mother turned, surprise flickering across her face. She had worked in houses like this long enough to understand when she was being summoned and when she was being acknowledged. This felt like the latter, and it made her uneasy. "Yes, Mr. Hartman, I wanted to thank you," William said, "for allowing Annie to spend time with my son." Her shoulders tightened slightly. "Annie just talks," she said quickly. "She's not doing anything special." William shook his head. "She is." Annie looked up at him, unsure what to do with the attention. "She's helping Lucas," William continued, "more than anyone else has." Miss Johnson hesitated, then spoke carefully. "My daughter has always been good with people who are hurting. I think she understands quiet pain." William nodded. He understood that too now. "If you're willing," he said, choosing his words with care, "I'd like Annie to continue spending time here, regularly, with my permission." Miss Johnson's eyes widened. "Sir, this wouldn't change your work," William added quickly. "And Annie would never be obligated." Only if she wants to. Annie tugged gently at her mother's hand. I want to, she said. Miss Johnson looked down at her daughter, then back at William. As long as she's safe, she said. And respected. William met her gaze steadily. She will be. That evening, Lucas asked a question that had been forming quietly all day. Dad? He said as William tucked the blanket around him. Yes? Why is Annie nice to me? The question caught William off guard. Why do you think she is? Lucas frowned. She doesn't have to be. Other people try too hard. She doesn't. William sat down on the edge of the bed. Some people help because they understand, he said, not because they're told to. Lucas considered this. Like Mom. William's breath caught. Yes, he said softly. Like your mom. Lucas hugged the blanket closer. I think Annie helps her remember me. Worksies. William blinked. What do you mean? Lucas stared at the ceiling. When I talk to Annie, it feels like Mom can hear me better. William reached out, placing his hand gently over Lucas's. The next few days brought more changes. Lucas began asking questions again. Small ones at first. Why leaves fell. Why the house creaked at night. Why people said, I'm fine, when they weren't. Annie answered what she could and admitted when she didn't know. Sometimes she answered with another question. Sometimes she answered with silence, sitting beside him until the question lost its sharp edge. One afternoon, as they sat on the steps outside, Lucas suddenly asked, Do you think Mom was scared? Annie didn't answer right away. I think, she said slowly, that she loved you more than she was scared. Lucas nodded, absorbing the thought. That makes it better. William watched from a distance, his phone forgotten in his hand. He realized then that Annie wasn't replacing anyone. She wasn't filling a space left by his wife. She was building a bridge. That night, after Lucas was asleep, William sat in his study and stared at the city lights beyond the window. He thought about legacy, about the things people left behind, buildings, accounts, foundations with carefully chosen names, and then he thought about his son, folding paper with a little girl on the floor, learning how to breathe again. William understood something then that no boardroom had ever taught him. Not all influence is loud. Some of it looks like a child sitting on the floor, staying when everyone else steps back. And that kind of influence changes everything. By the second week, the house had learned Annie's rhythm. She arrived in the afternoons, always after school. Her backpack lighter now that Lucas had claimed most of her loose paper for his drawings. She slipped off her shoes by the door, greeted the staff politely, and went straight to the sunroom without being told. Lucas waited for her, not anxiously anymore, not pressed against the window in fear she might not come, but with expectation. He counted time now. He noticed patterns. When the clock reached a certain place, his body leaned toward the door without him realizing it. William noticed that too. He also noticed something else. Lucas was no longer avoiding him. It happened in small, almost invisible ways. Lucas stayed in the room when William entered. He answered questions with more than one word. Sometimes, when Annie laughed at something, Lucas said, Lucas would glance toward his father, not for approval, but to include him. That inclusion felt heavier than any accusation. One afternoon, rain began falling hard against the windows, sudden and loud. Lucas startled at the sound, his pencil slipping from his fingers. Annie looked up. It's just rain. Lucas nodded, but his shoulders tightened. William crossed the room without thinking and knelt beside him. It's okay, he said, echoing words he'd heard Annie use 100 times now. It won't hurt the house. Lucas looked at him, searching his face. You promise? He asked. William met his gaze. I promise. Lucas relaxed. That night, after Annie left, William sat alone with the realization that frightened him most. His son trusted someone else before he trusted him. The thought didn't come with jealousy. It came with shame. William had loved his wife deeply. He had loved his son fiercely. But love, he was learning, was not the same as presence. Grief had swallowed him whole. And in his silence, Lucas had learned that his pain was something to carry alone. Annie had changed that without trying. The next morning, William made a decision. He canceled a meeting he'd waited months to secure. He delayed a conference call that could have reshaped a deal. He closed his laptop and left it that way. When Lucas came down for breakfast, William was still there. Lucas paused. "You're not leaving?" William smiled faintly. "Not today." "Oak." Lucas studied him for a moment, then climbed into his chair. They ate together in quiet, not awkward, not heavy, just shared. That afternoon, William joined Annie and Lucas on the floor. Annie looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "Do you know how to fold a crane?" she asked. William hesitated. "I can try." Lucas pushed a piece of paper toward him. "You fold wrong," he warned seriously. William smiled. "I probably will." He did, badly. Annie laughed, covering her mouth. Lucas stared at the misshapen result, then burst out laughing too, a sound so sudden and unguarded that William froze. Lucas laughed again, louder this time. William felt something break open inside him. "I told you," Lucas said between giggles. "You did it wrong." "I did," William admitted. "Can you show me?" Lucas nodded, suddenly very serious again, and leaned forward to guide his father's hands. "Like this," he said, slow, definite as Zio. William followed his son's instructions, his large hands clumsy under Lucas's careful direction. When they finished, the crane was still imperfect, but it stood. That evening, Annie lingered by the door as her mother gathered her things. "Mr. Hartman?" she asked. "Yes, Annie." "Lucas is doing better," she said earnestly, "but sometimes he still feels bad at night." William nodded. "I know." Annie hesitated. "He told me he worries you're sad too." William blinked. "He did?" Annie nodded. "He thinks if he's okay, you'll think he forgot his mom." The words struck deeper than William expected. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly. That night, William sat on the edge of Lucas's bed longer than usual. "Lucas," he said. "Yes?" "It's okay if you feel okay sometimes," William said. "It doesn't mean you forgot your mom." "I won't ever think that." Lucas was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sad?" he asked. William considered lying. Then he remembered Annie's honesty. "Yes," he said. "I am." Lucas turned onto his side to face him. "Even when I'm not crying?" "Yes," William said softly. "Even then." Lucas nodded. "Okay." He reached out and took his father's hand, small fingers wrapping around William's thumb. William stayed until his son fell asleep. Downstairs, Mrs. Caldwell watched from a distance, saying nothing. The staff had noticed the shift too, not just in Lucas, but in William. He was quieter, slower, more present. The house was changing, and not everyone would welcome that, because where healing grew, tension followed. And somewhere beyond the walls of the mansion, expectations, judgments, and quiet resentments were beginning to stir. But for now, in the soft light of a child's room, William Hartman allowed himself to believe something fragile and dangerous. That kindness, real kindness, might be stronger than grief. The first conflict did not announce itself with raised voices or confrontation. It arrived disguised as concern. William sensed it in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, in the way certain members of the staff exchanged looks when Annie sat beside Lucas, her small frame tucked comfortably against the vastness of the house, in the way Mrs. Caldwell's clipboard seemed to grow heavier in her arms, her smile more careful, more measured. Lucas, oblivious to all of it, was busy being a child again. That afternoon, he and Annie sat on the floor of the sunroom with a stack of blank pages between them. "Let's make a rule," Annie said. "1 page a day." Lucas frowned. "What if I have too many thoughts?" Annie smiled. "Then you use more pages." Lucas liked that answer. He pressed his pencil down and wrote slowly, sounding out each word under his breath. Annie waited, counting quietly in her head, giving him time. Outside the glass doors, William stood with Mrs. Caldwell. "I've received a call," she said carefully. "From a consultant." William didn't respond immediately. He had learned that silence often encouraged honesty. "She specializes in childhood grief," Mrs. Caldwell continued. "She's concerned about attachment." William turned to face her. "What kind of attachment?" "The girl," Mrs. Caldwell said. "Annie. There's worry that Lucas may be forming a dependency." Azar. William glanced through the glass at his son, who was currently arguing with Annie over whether a paper boat needed a name. "Lucas has been dependent on grief for 2 months, William said evenly. "I find this an improvement." Mrs. Caldwell hesitated. "People will talk," There it is, William replied. She stiffened. Sir, this isn't about Lucas's health, William said quietly. It's about how this looks. Mrs. Caldwell chose her words carefully. You are a public figure. Your son is vulnerable. And Annie is a child of staff. William felt the temperature in the air change. Say what you mean, he said. Mrs. Caldwell swallowed. Boundaries between households and employees' families exist for a reason. William's jaw tightened. Those boundaries didn't save my wife. They didn't save my son from drowning in silence. And they won't dictate who is allowed to sit beside him on the floor. And, inside, Lucas laughed at something Annie said, his head tipped back, his face open and unguarded. William gestured toward the glass. Look at him, he said. Really, look, Mrs. Caldwell did. Lucas was smiling, not the careful, practiced smile adults learn to perform. A real one. The kind that reached his eyes and softened his whole body. I will not remove the one constant that has helped my son breathe again, William said. Not to satisfy appearances. Mrs. Caldwell nodded slowly. Understood. But William knew the issue was far from settled. That evening, Annie arrived quieter than usual. Lucas noticed immediately. What's wrong? He asked. Annie shrugged. Nothing. Lucas studied her face the way she studied his when he said the same thing. You're doing the quiet thing. Annie smiled a little. Maybe. Lucas slid his notebook toward her. You can write too. Annie hesitated, then picked up the pencil. She wrote a single sentence. Sometimes grown-ups forget what matters. Lucas read it carefully. Who? Annie shrugged again. Some of them. Lucas frowned. That's silly. Annie laughed softly. Yeah, it is. That night, after Annie had gone home, Lucas lay awake longer than usual. William noticed when the light under his door didn't go out. He knocked gently. Lucas? Yes? Can I come in? Lucas nodded. William sat on the bed. You were quiet tonight. Lucas twisted the edge of his blanket. Do you think Annie will stop coming? The question struck harder than William expected. No, he said firmly. Why would you think that? Lucas shrugged. Grown-ups change things. William exhaled slowly. Some do, he said. But not this. Lucas searched his face. You promise? William leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I promise. Lucas relaxed. Just a little. She helps me remember Mom, Lucas said. But she also helps me remember other things. If do be Ebby. Like what? William asked. Lucas thought. Like how to laugh. William's chest tightened. The next day, the pressure became visible. A call from a board member. A suggestion from a family friend. A carefully worded message about optics and narratives. William listened to them all. Then he said no. He canceled a lunch. He postponed a meeting. He chose to sit on the floor again, folding paper badly while Lucas corrected him, and Annie laughed. In doing so, he crossed an invisible line. That afternoon, Miss Johnson approached him quietly. Mr. Hartman, she said, her voice hesitant. Annie came home upset yesterday. William's heart dropped. What happened? She thinks she's causing trouble, Miss Johnson said. She doesn't want Lucas to get hurt because of her. William closed his eyes briefly. I'm sorry, he said. That was never my intention. Miss Johnson studied him. My daughter doesn't need saving, she said gently. But she does need honesty. William nodded. So do I. That evening, he sat with Annie and Lucas together. I need to tell you something, he said. Lucas stiffened. Annie looked up, alert. Some people think it's strange that you spend time together. William continued. They're wrong, but they exist. Annie swallowed. Am I in trouble? No, William said immediately. You've done nothing wrong. Lucas scooted closer to her. She helps me, he said fiercely. William smiled sadly. I know. He looked at Annie. And I won't take that away. Annie nodded, tears shining but not falling. Okay. Lucas took her hand. The house grew quiet again that night. But it was a different quiet now. Tighter, watchful, because when something pure disrupts an established order, the order always pushes back. And William Hartman knew this was no longer just about helping his son heal. It was about choosing what kind of man and what kind of world he was willing to defend. The tension that had been hovering around the house finally settled into something heavier. It was no longer just glances or careful pauses. It was structure beginning to resist change. William felt it the moment he walked into the morning meeting with his senior staff. The room fell quiet too quickly. Faces were polite, attentive but guarded. These were people who had worked for him for years, who understood his habits, his grief, his authority. They were not used to him defying expectation inside his own home. "Before we begin," William said, standing at the head of the table, "I want to be clear about something." No one spoke. "My son's well-being is not a discussion point," he continued. "It is not an image concern. It is not a risk factor to be managed. Any decisions affecting him will be made by me." Mrs. Caldwell nodded. A few others shifted in their seats. "There have been concerns raised," one executive said carefully, "about dependency." William looked at him. "Grief looks like dependency to people who don't understand it." Silence. "I won't remove what is helping my child heal," William said. "That includes Annie." The meeting ended shortly after. Outside the conference room, William exhaled slowly. He had fought tougher battles in boardrooms, but none that left his hands trembling like this. Power was easier to wield when emotions were not involved. Later that afternoon, Lucas sensed the shift. He was quieter than usual, his pencil hovering over the page without touching it. "You're thinking too loud," Annie said gently. Lucas blinked. "How do you know?" "You're doing the stare thing," she said, tapping her temple. "That's when my head gets noisy too." Lucas hesitated. "Do you ever feel like people want things to go back to how they were?" Annie nodded. "Yeah, two-way. Even if how they were was bad?" Lucas asked. "Especially then," Annie replied. Lucas pressed the pencil down harder than necessary, leaving a dark line across the page. "I don't want things to go back." Annie leaned closer. "Then don't let them." He looked at her. "What if I can't stop it?" Annie thought for a moment. "Then you remember what's real." "What's real?" Lucas asked. She pointed at the paper. "This. You. Me. Your dad trying." Lucas considered that. His shoulders relaxed. That evening, William overheard something that made him stop in the hallway. Lucas was speaking to Annie in a voice barely above a whisper. "If they make you leave," he said, "I won't forget you." Annie's heart clenched. "Hey," she said gently. "Nobody's leaving today. But if they do," Lucas insisted. Annie met his eyes. "Then you remember that you got through something hard. Not because of me. Because of you." Lucas frowned. "But you helped." Annie smiled. "Helping isn't the same as owning." William leaned against the wall, eyes closing briefly. He had underestimated this child. Not her kindness, but her strength. The next day, the conflict surfaced openly. A family advisor requested a private conversation. He spoke in calm, practiced tones about perception, about donors, about narratives that could be misinterpreted. William listened. Then he stood. "My son is not a narrative," he said. "And Annie is not a problem to be solved." Oat. The advisor left shortly after. That afternoon, Miss Johnson approached William again, her expression troubled. "Annie came home crying," she said quietly. "She thinks she's causing trouble for you." William felt the words like a blow. "I never wanted her to feel that way," he said. "I know," Miss Johnson replied. "But she's 6. She feels things before she understands them." William nodded. "Please tell her she's welcome here. That this is not her fault." "I will," Miss Johnson said. "But she may need to hear it from you." That evening, William sat with Annie and Lucas in the sunroom. "I need to say something important," he began. Lucas stiffened. Annie straightened. "There are people who think I should make different choices," William said. "They're wrong. And they don't get to decide who matters in this house." Annie swallowed. Am I making it worse?" "No," William said firmly. "You're making it better." Lucas reached for her hand without thinking. William watched their fingers intertwine, small and steady. "I'm going to protect this," William continued. "Both of you." Annie nodded slowly. "Okay." That night, Lucas slept with his notebook open beside him. Inside, in careful, uneven letters, he had written, "I am sad. I am okay. Both can stay." William read it long after Lucas fell asleep. For the first time, he understood something fundamental. Healing does not erase pain. It teaches you how to live beside it. And that lesson taught by a 6-year-old girl who had no power except her presence was something no one would take away. The breaking point did not come with anger. It came with fear. Lucas woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in darkness. For a few long seconds, he lay still, listening. The quiet felt different, thicker, like it had weight. His chest tightened, a familiar pressure creeping back in. He reached for his notebook. It wasn't there. His fingers searched the sheets, the bedside table, the floor. Nothing. His breath came faster, sharper. The edges of the room felt too far away. "Dad," he whispered. No answer. Lucas sat up, panic rising. The notebook was where he kept the words he couldn't say out loud, where Annie had helped him put the heavy feelings so they wouldn't crowd his chest at night. Without it, everything rushed back at once. He slid out of bed and padded into the hallway, his bare feet cold against the floor. The house felt enormous at this hour. The ceilings too high, the shadows too deep. "Dad?" he called again, louder this time. A light flicked on at the far end of the hall. William appeared, hair rumpled, concern already on his face. "Lucas, what's wrong?" "My book," Lucas said, his voice shaking. William knelt in front of him immediately. "Okay," he said calmly. "We'll find it." Lucas shook his head, tears welling. What if it's gone? William didn't dismiss the fear. He'd learned better. "Let's look together," he said. They searched the room quietly. Under the bed, on the desk, by the window. Lucas's breathing stayed fast, shallow. William found it last slipped behind the pillow, hidden by the blanket. "Here." Lucas lunged forward and grabbed it, pressing it to his chest like something alive. William watched his son's shoulders slowly lower, the panic ebbing. I thought maybe someone took it," Lucas whispered. William felt a cold realization settle in. That fear hadn't come from nowhere. Later that morning, after Lucas had calmed and returned to sleep, William stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the dark window. The house was waking now, soft footsteps, the murmur of voices, but the sense of unease lingered. Someone had made Lucas feel unsafe. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but enough. When Annie arrived that afternoon, Lucas ran to her without hesitation, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I lost my book," he said breathlessly. "But Dad found it." "Oh." Annie knelt to his level. "That must have been scary." Lucas nodded. "I thought they took it." Annie glanced up, meeting William's eyes across the room. William felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. That evening, he called a meeting. Not with executives, not with advisors, with the staff. They gathered in the sitting room, standing in a loose semicircle. Faces curious, concerned, guarded. William stood in front of them, hands clasped, his voice steady. "I want to address something directly," he said. "There has been tension in this house. I've felt it. My son has felt it." A ripple moved through the room. "This is my home," William continued. "And Lucas's. Healing here is not optional. It is not subject to comfort or appearance." He paused. "Annie is welcome here," he said clearly. "She is not a problem. She is not crossing boundaries. She is helping my son survive something no child should have to carry alone." Silence. "If anyone has an issue with that," William added, his tone calm but unyielding, "bring it to me. Not to whispers, not to looks, not to a child." Mrs. Caldwell nodded slowly. Others followed. The meeting ended without argument. That night, Lucas slept soundly. Annie sat with him earlier, helping him write one last sentence before bed. "I was scared. I am safe." When Annie left, William walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said quietly. Annie looked up at him, serious beyond her years. "You're doing better," she said. William blinked. "I am?" She nodded. "You stay now." William felt something warm and painful bloom in his chest. "I'm trying," he said. Annie smiled. "That counts." As the door closed behind her, William stood for a long moment, listening to the house settle. He knew there would be more challenges, more pressure, more moments where the easy choice would be to step back, to smooth things over. to return to the old, quiet distance. But he also knew this. His son was learning how to feel safe again, and William would not let fear take that away. The calm that followed felt fragile, like glass left out in the cold. For a few days, nothing went wrong. And that, in itself, made William uneasy. Lucas continued to improve in small, steady ways. He asked questions again, not just about his mother, but about ordinary things. Why the gardener trimmed the hedges the way he did. Why birds always seemed louder in the morning. Why Annie liked bitter orange peels. Annie answered what she could and shrugged when she didn't know. Sometimes she turned the questions back on Lucas, letting him decide what he thought. William watched all of it with careful attention, aware now that healing was not a straight line. It curved. It doubled back. It tested you when you least expected it. The test came on a Tuesday afternoon. Lucas had been waiting by the window, notebook in his lap, when the black sedan pulled into the driveway. He stiffened at the sight of it. "Dad?" he called. William appeared at once. "Yes? There's a car," Lucas said. Not the usual one. William followed his gaze and felt his stomach tighten. "I have a meeting," he said carefully. "Someone from my company." Lucas hugged his notebook closer. "Will it take long?" "I don't think so," William replied. Lucas hesitated. "Can Annie stay?" William glanced at the clock. Annie was already there, sitting on the floor nearby, drawing quietly. "Yes," William said. "She can stay." 8. Lucas nodded, reassured, and returned to his page. William met the visitor in the study. The conversation was polite, efficient, and edged with something sharp. "There are concerns," the man said smoothly, "about precedent." William leaned back in his chair. "About my son?" "About appearances," the man corrected. William smiled faintly. "That's what people say when they don't want to admit what they're really worried about." The man cleared his throat. "There is a perception." William raised a hand. "We're done." The meeting ended shortly after. When William returned to the sunroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Lucas sat very still, his eyes on the floor. Annie was beside him, her posture alert, one hand resting lightly on the notebook. "What happened?" William asked gently. Lucas didn't answer. Annie looked up. "Someone said something," she said quietly. William's chest tightened. "To Lucas?" Annie nodded. "By the window. I didn't hear all of it. Just enough." William knelt in front of his son. "Lucas?" Lucas's voice was barely audible. "They said I'm spoiled, that I'm weak, that I should be over it by now." The words hit harder than any accusation William had faced in his life. "Who said that?" he asked, already knowing. Lucas shook his head. "It doesn't matter." "It does," William said, his voice firm but controlled. "Because it's wrong." Lucas swallowed. Annie told them to stop. With 17, William turned to her, stunned. "You did?" Annie nodded, her chin lifting just slightly. "They were mean." "What did you say?" William asked. "I said," Annie replied, choosing her words carefully, "that being sad doesn't mean you're weak. It means you loved someone." Lucas's fingers tightened around the notebook. William closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying himself. He stood. "Stay here," he told the children gently. William walked to the front hallway, his steps measured but unyielding. The staff member who had spoken stood near the door, startled when William approached. "You do not speak to my son that way," William said quietly. "I didn't mean—" "You meant enough," William interrupted. "This house is not a place where grief is timed or judged. If that's a problem for you, this is not the right place to work." The man went pale. "Mr. Hartman, go," William said. When he returned to the sunroom, Lucas was crying silently, tears dropping onto the open pages of his notebook. William sat beside him and pulled him close, not worrying about whether this was the right technique or the correct response. "I'm sorry," William said softly. "You didn't deserve that." Lucas's shoulders shook. "They were right," he whispered. "I am weak." "No," Annie said immediately. William echoed her. "No." Lucas looked between them, confused, hurt. "You are strong," William continued. "Strong enough to feel, strong enough to keep going, strong enough to let someone help you." Lucas's breathing slowed, just a little. Annie leaned in. Being strong doesn't mean you stop hurting, she said. It means you don't let hurting turn you mean. Lucas wiped his face with his sleeve. I don't want to be mean. You're not, William said. They sat together for a long time after that, the room quiet but not empty. That night, Lucas wrote more than he had in days. They were messy sentences, uneven and raw. Some people are mean. I am still here. Annie stayed. Dad stayed. William read the page later, his chest aching with a mixture of pride and regret. He realized something then. Something he hadn't fully accepted before. Protecting his son did not mean shielding him from the world forever. It meant standing beside him when the world showed its teeth. The next morning, Lucas woke tired but calm. Dad? He asked at breakfast. Yes. Can Annie come even if people don't like it? William met his eyes. Yes. Lucas nodded. Okay. That afternoon, Annie arrived as usual. Lucas greeted her with a smile that was smaller than it had been the day before but stronger. I wrote more, he said. Annie grinned. I knew you would. William watched them settle onto the floor again, the notebook opening between them like a bridge. He understood now that this story, his son's healing, Annie's quiet courage, his own reckoning was no longer private. People would notice. They would judge. They would push back. But William Hartman had made his choice, and he would not step aside again. The story reached the outside world sooner than William expected. It began with a phone call from his public relations director, her voice unusually hesitant. William, she said, there's been chatter. William closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. About what? About your son, she replied. And the little girl. William said nothing. Someone from the staff spoke to a friend, she continued. It spread. Not details. Exactly. Just impressions. People are speculating. Speculating about what? William asked, though he already knew. About boundaries, about favoritism, about race, she said quietly. And about you. There it was. William exhaled slowly. And your recommendation? A pause. We can issue a statement, frame it as temporary support. Controlled interaction. William's jaw tightened. My son is not a press release. I know, she said quickly. I just wanted you to be aware. After the call ended, William remained seated for a long time, staring out the window. The city beyond the glass looked unchanged, indifferent to the small war unfolding inside his home. Down the hall, Lucas was laughing. The sound reached William faintly, but clearly enough to make his chest tighten. He followed it to the sunroom. Annie and Lucas were sitting back to back on the floor, a stack of books between them. Your turn, Annie said. Lucas opened a book and read slowly, stumbling over a few words but refusing help. The fox waited. He read, then frowned. Why would it wait? Annie shrugged. Maybe it was tired. Lucas thought about that. Or maybe it didn't want to scare anyone. Annie smiled. I like that one. William stood in the doorway, unseen. 2 months ago, Lucas wouldn't have touched a book. Wouldn't have spoken long enough to ask a question like that. And now the world wanted to turn this into a problem. That evening, William made another decision. He invited Annie's mother to sit with him after dinner. Miss Johnson folded her hands in her lap, her posture careful but steady. She had learned how to navigate spaces where power lived in the air. I wanted to speak openly, William said, before rumors turn into something worse. Miss Johnson nodded. Annie hears more than people think. I imagine she does, William said, and I don't want her to feel responsible for adult discomfort. Miss Johnson met his gaze. My daughter helps your son because she wants to, but she won't stay where she isn't welcome. She is welcome, William said firmly. And she will remain so. Miss Johnson hesitated. Even if it becomes inconvenient, William smiled without humor, especially then. Miss Johnson studied him for a long moment. Then I trust you, she said. Later that night, Lucas overheard a fragment of conversation he wasn't meant to hear. 2 staff members spoke quietly near the kitchen, unaware that Lucas had stopped at the corner of the hallway. They're saying things online, one whispered. About the girl. It's going to be trouble. The other replied. People don't like it when lines blur. Lucas's chest tightened. He turned and ran. William found him in the sunroom. curled into himself, notebook clutched tight. "Lucas," William said softly, kneeling beside him. "What happened?" "They don't want Annie here," Lucas whispered. "They think she's wrong." William felt a familiar anger rise, hot and sharp. He pushed it down. "Look at me," he said gently. Lucas did. "Annie is not wrong," William said, "and neither are you." Lucas's voice trembled. "What if they make you choose?" William didn't answer right away. He chose honesty instead. "I already have," he said. Lucas searched his face, afraid to believe it. "I choose you," William continued. "And I choose what helps you heal." Lucas's breathing slowed. Annie arrived the next afternoon to a different atmosphere. The house was quieter, the tension more visible. She sensed it immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. Lucas looked at her. "People are mad." Annie frowned. "At who?" "At you," Lucas said. "And me." Annie was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "people get mad when they don't understand something." Lucas hugged his notebook. "Will you stop coming?" Annie shook her head. "Not unless you tell me to." Lucas shook his head fiercely. "Don't." Annie smiled softly. "Then I won't." That evening, William sat alone in his study and did something he hadn't done in years. He wrote, not contracts, not notes, words. He wrote about his wife, about Lucas, about grief, about how a child had taught his son to breathe again when nothing else worked. He didn't publish it. He didn't send it. But for the first time, he stopped pretending this was something to manage quietly. The next morning, Lucas asked a question that surprised him. "Dad," he said, "why do people care so much what other people think?" William considered this. "Because they're afraid." "Of what?" "That if something different works," William said, "it means they were wrong before." Within dining, Lucas nodded slowly. "I don't want to be afraid like that." William smiled sadly. "Neither do I." That afternoon, Annie helped Lucas write a new page. "People talk. I stay. Annie stays. Dad stays." William watched from the doorway, his chest tight with resolve. The pressure from the outside would grow. He knew that. The questions would get sharper, the judgment louder, but the truth was already written in a child's careful handwriting. Some things were worth defending out loud. The article went live on a Thursday morning. William hadn't planned it that way. He hadn't even planned for it to be an article at all. But once the words were written, once they existed outside his head, keeping them hidden felt like another form of cowardice. He didn't use his name in the headline. He didn't need to. A father's quiet lesson in grief and grace was enough. By noon, his phone had not stopped vibrating. William ignored it. Instead, he sat at the breakfast table with Lucas, watching his son eat half a pancake without being prompted. That alone would have felt like a miracle 2 months ago. "Dad," Lucas said suddenly, syrup on his lip. "Why are you smiling?" William hadn't realized he was. "Just thinking," he said. Lucas nodded, accepting the answer without suspicion. He picked up his fork again, humming under his breath. It was tuneless and soft, but it was sound. It was life. Annie arrived just after lunch. She sensed something immediately. Adults moved differently when something big had happened. Their voices were quieter, their steps more careful, like they were walking around invisible glass. "What's going on?" she asked Lucas. Lucas shrugged. "Dad wrote something." Annie blinked. "Like, homework?" Lucas shook his head. "Grown-up homework." William heard them from the hallway and smiled despite himself. That afternoon, the first call came from the board. Then another. Then another. William declined them all. By evening, the story had spread beyond the circles he usually controlled. Comments, opinions, praise and criticism tangled together in the same breath. Some people called him brave, others called him reckless, a few called him worse. Lucas did not see any of it. That night, William tucked his son into bed himself. Annie had already gone home, promising to bring more paper cranes the next day. "Dad?" Lucas asked sleepily. "Yes? Did you do something bad?" William froze. "Why would you think that?" Lucas hesitated. "People were talking louder today." William sat on the edge of the bed. "I told the truth," he said gently. "And sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable." Lucas thought about that. "Did it help?" William smiled. I think it did. Lucas nodded, satisfied. Okay. He rolled onto his side, clutching his notebook. Within minutes, his breathing slowed into sleep. William stayed longer than necessary, listening. Downstairs, the house felt different, quieter, but not tense, as if something had finally been named. The next morning, Annie's mother arrived with her. Her posture more guarded than usual. Miss Johnson didn't sit right away. I read it, she said. William nodded. I expected you might. There was a long pause. Then Miss Johnson exhaled. Thank you. William looked up, surprised. For saying what a lot of people don't, she continued. For not pretending this is something else. William inclined his head. Your daughter helped my son when I didn't know how. Miss Johnson smiled faintly. She just listened. That, William said, is rarer than people admit. Later that day, a reporter appeared at the gate. William did not let him in. He stood on the other side of the iron bars, calm and composed. This isn't a story about controversy, William said evenly. It's about a child who needed kindness, and another child who offered it. People are saying, the reporter began. William cut him off. People always say things. I'm not interested. The gate closed. Inside, Lucas was teaching Annie how to draw a fox. It waits, Lucas explained seriously, so it doesn't scare anyone. Annie nodded solemnly. Smart fox. That evening, something unexpected happened. Lucas asked to visit the garden after dinner. At dusk, at the place where he hadn't been since the funeral. William felt his chest tighten. Are you sure? Lucas nodded. Annie can come. They walked slowly, the air cool, the sky painted with fading gold. Lucas stopped near the old bench where his mother used to sit. He didn't cry. He didn't run away. He just stood there, quiet. Annie stayed beside him without speaking. After a long moment, Lucas opened his notebook and wrote, Mom is not here, but I am, and I am not alone. William felt something break open inside him. Not grief. Release. The following week, the noise outside peaked and then began to fade. There were meetings, statements, consequences. William handled them all. But inside the house, something steadier had taken root. Lucas laughed more easily now. He slept through the night more often than not. He no longer flinched at every raised voice. And Annie was still Annie. Quiet, observant, unimpressed by status. One afternoon, as they sat together folding paper, Lucas asked her, Why do you think Dad wrote that thing? Annie thought for a moment. Maybe he didn't want to hide anymore. Lucas nodded. Hiding is lonely, Annie smiled. Yeah. William watched from across the room, aware that whatever storms lay ahead, something essential had already changed. The house was no longer a place of silence. It was a place of truth. And truth, once spoken, had a way of demanding more. The calm did not mean safety. William learned that lesson on a Monday morning, when the call came from Lucas's school counselor. Mr. Hartman, she said carefully, I wanted to let you know about an incident. William closed his eyes. Go on. There were comments, she continued, from other parents, not directly to Lucas, but within earshot. He handled himself well, but I thought you should know. William's jaw tightened. What kind of comments? About grief, she said. About influence. About whether your son is being encouraged to move on too slowly, as if grief were a schedule someone could keep. I appreciate you telling me, William said evenly. Lucas won't be returning for the rest of the week. After the call ended, William sat motionless for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the sunroom. Lucas was on the floor with Annie, lining up paper cranes by size. Dad, Lucas said, looking up. This one's the biggest. 21. William knelt beside him. Lucas, how would you feel about taking a few days off from school? Lucas frowned. Am I in trouble? No, William said quickly. Not at all. Lucas glanced at Annie. Did I do something wrong? Annie shook her head. You didn't. William placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes adults don't know how to be kind when things make them uncomfortable. That's not your fault. Lucas thought about that. They were whispering. He said quietly. I heard my name. William felt a familiar ache. I'm sorry. Lucas shrugged, a gesture that was still too old for a child his age. Annie says whispers are just scared voices. Annie looked startled. I didn't say it like that. Lucas smiled faintly. But you meant it. William exhaled slowly. That afternoon, William canceled every meeting on his calendar. He took Lucas and Annie into the city instead. They didn't go anywhere grand. No museums, no monuments. They went to a small diner that still smelled like coffee and buttered toast, where the waitress called everyone on and didn't care who William Hartman was. Lucas ordered grilled cheese. Annie ordered the same. They split fries. William watched Lucas eat without being coaxed, watched him laugh when Annie pretended to steal his fries and then gave them back. For the first time since his wife's funeral, William felt something close to normal. Not happiness. Balance. On the way home, Lucas fell asleep in the back seat. His head tipped toward Annie's shoulder. She stayed very still, afraid to wake him. William noticed. He also noticed the looks they got at stoplights, the quick glances, the assumptions. He ignored them. That night, after Annie had gone home and Lucas was asleep, William sat alone in his study. The article had changed things. He could feel it, not just outside these walls, but inside him. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, chosen a truth that demanded consistency. There would be consequences. He accepted that. The consequences came sooner than expected. The next day, his legal advisor called. There's talk of formal complaints, she said, from a parent group. About what? William asked, already weary. About environment, she replied. They're framing it as concern for emotional influence. William laughed once, humorless. Emotional influence is exactly what my son needs. I know, she said gently, but they're pushing for evaluations. Oversight. William's voice hardened. Over my son? Yes. No, William said flatly. That won't happen. William, she warned. This could escalate. Let it. He replied. That evening, William told Annie's mother what was happening. Miss Johnson listened quietly, her expression unreadable. This may get harder, William said. I won't pretend otherwise. Miss Johnson nodded. I know. If at any point you feel this puts Annie at risk socially, emotionally, say the word, William added. I'll understand. Miss Johnson met his eyes. Annie has already chosen. William frowned slightly. Chosen what? To be kind when it's inconvenient, she said. That's not something you unlearn. Later that night, Lucas sensed something was wrong. He always did. Dad, he said from his bed. Are people still mad? William sat beside him. Some are. Lucas stared at the ceiling. Is it because of Annie? William hesitated, then decided not to lie. Some people don't understand why she matters, he said. Lucas turned his head. She matters because she stays. William swallowed. Yes. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said finally, I'll stay too. William felt his throat tighten. The next morning, Lucas wrote something new in his notebook. People can leave. I don't have to. Annie read it carefully. That's brave, she said. Lucas shrugged. It's just true. They spent the day building a small paper town on the floor of the sunroom. Houses, trees, little folded people. Lucas made one with two figures holding hands. This is my mom and me, he said. Annie nodded. Then Lucas made another. This one's me now. Annie looked closer. Why does it have two shadows? Lucas smiled, just a little. Because I'm not alone anymore. William watched from the doorway, his chest tight with emotion he no longer tried to suppress. The world outside could argue, complain, threaten. Inside this house, something stronger than fear was growing, and William knew this was the point of no return. The letter arrived on heavy cream paper, sealed with a crest William recognized immediately. He did not open it at first. He stood in the foyer for a long moment, the envelope resting in his palm like a quiet threat. Lucas was in the sunroom with Annie, their voices low, focused. The sound grounded him. William opened the letter. It was formal, polite, sharp between the lines, a request for a meeting. A discussion of concerns, language carefully chosen to sound reasonable while implying authority. A reminder that reputations were fragile things. William folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. He did not feel afraid. He felt tired. That afternoon, he took Lucas to the garden alone. Annie sat with Miss Johnson under the shade of the oak, talking softly. William and Lucas walked along the path of trimmed hedges, their pace slow. "Dad," Lucas said after a while, "are you in trouble?" William stopped. He knelt so they were eye level. "No," he said, "but some people want me to explain myself." Lucas frowned. "Why?" "Because I chose something they wouldn't have," William replied, "and that makes them uncomfortable." Lucas considered this. "Do you have to go?" "Yes," William said. "I think I do." Lucas nodded, then surprised him. "Can I help?" William smiled gently. "You already are." When quote. The meeting took place 2 days later in a glass-walled conference room downtown. The city stretched below them, distant and indifferent. 3 people sat across from William. Their expressions were neutral, concerned, carefully composed. They spoke about optics, about precedent, about safeguarding children. William listened. When they finished, he spoke quietly. "My son lost his mother," he said. He stopped speaking. He stopped eating. He stopped wanting to exist. The room was silent. A 6-year-old girl sat with him when no one else could. William continued. She did not fix him. She did not replace his grief. She stayed. One of them shifted uncomfortably. "You are asking me," William said, "to treat that as a liability." He shook his head. "I won't." The meeting ended without resolution. Outside, William stood on the sidewalk and breathed in the cold air. For the first time in years, he felt something close to certainty. That evening, Annie arrived quieter than usual. Lucas noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" Annie hesitated. "Some kids at school said things." Lucas's shoulders stiffened. "About you?" Annie nodded. "What did they say?" he asked, his voice small but fierce. "That I don't belong in big houses," Annie replied. "That I'm only here because my mom works here." Lucas stood up. "That's not true," Annie smiled sadly. "It's a little true." "No," Lucas insisted. "You're here because you help me." Annie blinked. William watched from the doorway, his chest tight. Annie knelt in front of Lucas. "Sometimes," she said gently, "people try to make things smaller so they feel bigger." Lucas frowned. "That's dumb." Annie laughed quietly. "Yeah." That night, Lucas struggled to sleep. William sat beside him, the house quiet around them. "Dad," Lucas whispered, "what if they make Annie sad enough to leave?" William closed his eyes briefly. Then he answered honestly, "I will do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen," he said. Lucas nodded, his fingers tightening around the blanket. "Okay." The next morning, William made a call. Not to lawyers, not to advisors, to a journalist he trusted. The story that followed was different from the first. It wasn't about grief this time. It was about belonging, about who gets to decide where kindness fits, about a house that chose love over comfort. The reaction was immediate and divided, but something else happened too. Letters arrived. Not emails, letters. From parents, teachers, grandparents, people who recognized the quiet battles, who remembered sitting alone once, who understood what it meant when someone stayed. Lucas helped William open them, reading the simple words out loud. "You're not alone," one said. "Thank you for choosing your child," said another. Lucas held one letter carefully. "This person says they were sad for a long time too." William nodded. "A lot of people are." That afternoon, Annie brought a new idea. "We should make something," she said. Lucas brightened. "Like what?" "A place," Annie replied. "For quiet." They cleared a corner of the sunroom. Pillows, paper, a small lamp. Lucas taped a sign to the wall in careful handwriting. "You can sit here." William read it and felt his throat tighten. Days passed. The pressure did not disappear, but it changed. People stopped whispering and started asking. Questions turned slower, softer, and one evening, a knock came at the door. A woman stood there with her young son, her expression nervous. "I read the article," she said. "My boy. He hasn't talked since his sister died." William stepped aside without hesitation. "Come in." Lucas watched from the hallway as the boy sat in the quiet corner, clutching a toy too tightly. Annie approached him slowly and sat down without speaking. The boy didn't look up, but he didn't leave. William realized then that what they were building could not be undone. It would invite scrutiny, resistance, risk, but it would also invite truth. That night, Lucas wrote again. People can try to take things, but they can't take what stays inside. William closed the notebook gently. The world had drawn its line. So had he. The quiet corner did not stay quiet for long. By the end of the week, 3 children had sat there at different times, each arriving with the same hesitant posture, the same guarded eyes. None of them spoke much at first. None of them were asked to. William watched from a distance, careful not to intrude. He had learned that healing recoiled from pressure. It needed space, permission. Lucas understood this instinctively. He didn't rush the other children. He didn't try to explain himself or his grief. He simply stayed near, folding paper or drawing, letting the silence do its work. Annie guided without directing. She sat on the floor, legs crossed, her presence calm and unassuming. Sometimes she offered a pencil, sometimes a folded crane, sometimes nothing at all. It was enough. The backlash arrived in quieter forms now. Emails framed as concern, invitations framed as obligations, warnings disguised as advice. William read them all and answered very few. Instead, he focused on what he could see. Lucas slept through the night almost every day now. His appetite had returned in uneven but promising waves. He still missed his mother, but the grief no longer swallowed him whole. One afternoon, William found Lucas in the garden alone, sitting on the bench where his wife used to read. "You okay?" William asked softly. Lucas nodded. "I was thinking about Mom." William sat beside him. "What about her?" Lucas swung his legs. "I think she'd like Annie." William smiled. "I think she would too." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "I don't feel bad when I think about her anymore," he said, almost surprised. "Just sad." William felt a swell of emotion he didn't try to hide. "That's okay," he said. "Sad means she mattered." That evening, Annie's mother pulled William aside. "I want to be honest with you," Miss Johnson said. "People are talking to Annie too. Not just at school." "The senior," William nodded. "I expected that. She's handling it," Miss Johnson continued. "But she's still a child." "I know," William said quietly. "And I won't let her carry this alone." Miss Johnson studied him. "What are you planning?" William hesitated, then spoke plainly. "To make this visible and protected." The following week, William announced a foundation. He did not attach his name to it. It focused on grief support for children, quiet spaces, trained listeners, no cameras, no speeches. The announcement stirred the waters again. Some praised it, others questioned motives. William ignored both. Lucas learned about it by accident. "You made a place?" he asked, eyes wide. "Like the quiet corner?" "Yes," William said. "Like that, but bigger." Lucas thought about it. "Can Annie help?" William smiled. "If she wants to." Annie, when told, considered carefully. "I don't want to be special," she said finally. William nodded. "You won't be." "Okay," she said. "Then I'll help." Not everyone welcomed the change. One afternoon, a staff member confronted Annie's mother near the service entrance. "She's getting ideas," the woman said sharply. "This isn't her place." Miss Johnson did not raise her voice. "My daughter belongs wherever she is treated with dignity." The confrontation reached William within the hour. He dismissed the staff member before sunset. The message spread quickly. Lucas noticed. "People look different now," he said to Annie. Annie shrugged. "Sometimes they're just surprised." Lucas smiled faintly. "I'm not." The first official session of the foundation took place in a small rented space downtown. No banners, no press. Just a room with soft light, chairs arranged in a circle, and a basket of paper and crayons in the center. Lucas insisted on going. William hesitated, then agreed. They arrived early. A boy sat in the corner, twisting the strap of his backpack. A girl stared at the floor, her hands clenched. Lucas walked over and sat down without speaking. Annie followed. They folded paper. The others watched. Eventually, the boy asked, "What are you making?" "A fox," Lucas said. "It waits." The boy nodded. Later that night, Lucas fell asleep on the ride home, his head resting against the window. William drove in silence, his thoughts heavy but steady. He knew there were still risks ahead. Legal challenges, public pressure, the subtle violence of opinion. But he also knew this was no longer just about his son. It was about refusing to teach children that grief should be hidden, or that kindness must justify itself. At home, William carried Lucas to bed. As he tucked the blanket around him, Lucas stirred. "Dad?" he murmured. "Yes? Promise you won't stop." William leaned down, his voice firm and quiet. "I promise." Lucas smiled in his sleep. Down the hall, Annie sat at the kitchen table with her mother, drawing. "What are you making?" Miss Johnson asked. "A house," Annie replied. "With lots of doors," Miss Johnson smiled. "Why so many?" "So no one gets stuck outside," Annie said simply. The next morning, a letter arrived addressed to William in careful handwriting. Inside was a single sentence. "Thank you for seeing my child." William folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer with the others. He looked out the window toward the sunroom, where Lucas and Annie were already at work, quiet and focused. He knew now that the line he had crossed was not behind him. It was ahead, and he would walk it. The first real threat arrived quietly, not as outrage, not as accusation, as paperwork. William received the notice on a Friday afternoon, slipped among routine correspondence. An inquiry. Formal. Neutral. It referenced the foundation, the informal gatherings, the presence of children on private property. Words like oversight and compliance appeared more than once. William read it twice, then set it down. He did not panic. He felt something colder. That evening, Lucas sensed the shift before anyone told him. "You're thinking too loud," he said to William during dinner. William paused. "Am I?" Lucas nodded. "Your face is doing the quiet frown." Annie looked up from her plate. "That's a real thing," she confirmed. William smiled faintly. "I'll try to think softer." But later, after Lucas had gone to bed and Annie had left with her mother, William sat alone in his study and allowed himself to feel the weight of it. This was no longer just discomfort from others. This was a challenge. The following week brought meetings, lawyers, careful conversations that circled around the same unspoken question. "Why are you pushing this?" William answered honestly every time. "Because my child needed it. Because other children do too. Because silence didn't work. Some listened, some didn't." One advisor leaned back in his chair and said, "You're risking a great deal for something that doesn't have to be yours to fix." William met his gaze. "It already is." The tension seeped into the house despite everyone's best efforts. Lucas became quieter for 2 days. Not withdrawn, but watchful. Annie noticed. "You're counting again," she said softly. Lucas frowned. "I am? You do it when you're worried," Annie replied. "You count the windows." Lucas looked up at the tall glass panes. "I don't want it to go away." Annie didn't pretend not to understand. "I don't either." That night, Lucas asked William a question he'd been holding back. "Dad," he said from his bed, "are they going to stop the quiet place?" William sat beside him. He did not rush his answer. "They might try," he said carefully. Lucas's fingers twisted in the blanket. "Did we do something wrong?" "No," William said immediately. "We did something right. That's why it's hard." Lucas swallowed. Sometimes, Mom said doing the right thing makes people mad." William felt his throat tighten. "Your mother was very wise." Lucas nodded, then surprised him. "Then don't stop," he said. "Even if they're mad." William closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his resolve was steady. "I won't," he said. "I promise." The challenge escalated publicly a few days later. An opinion piece appeared, framed as concern for boundaries, questioning whether grief was being managed responsibly. It did not name Lucas. It did not need to. William did not respond. Instead, he invited someone else to speak. At the next foundation session, he asked a mother to share her story. She stood with shaking hands and spoke about her daughter who had stopped speaking after a car accident, about the quiet corner, about the first crayon mark her child had made in months. There were no cameras, but someone wrote about it anyway. The tone shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Meanwhile, Annie faced her own test. A teacher pulled her aside at school and suggested she might be over-involved elsewhere, that perhaps her focus should remain where it belonged. Annie listened politely. Then she went home and asked her mother, "What does know your place mean?" Miss Johnson answered honestly. Annie thought about it for a long time. The next day, she brought a drawing to Lucas. It showed a big house with many doors. Outside, a group of small figures waited. Inside, someone was holding the door open. "This is what I think," Annie said. Lucas studied it. "That's you." Annie shrugged. It could be anyone. William saw the drawing later and understood something essential. This was no longer about defending a choice. It was about defending a value. The formal review meeting took place the following Thursday. William attended alone. He listened as concerns were laid out, as regulations were cited, as hypotheticals were raised. When it was his turn to speak, he did not argue. He told a story about a boy who could not sleep, about a notebook, about a 6-year-old girl who said, "I'm here," and meant it. He spoke calmly, without embellishment. When he finished, the room was silent. One woman cleared her throat. "What you're describing," she said slowly, "is not negligence." "Oh, guys." "No," William agreed. "It's care." The decision was deferred, but something had shifted. At home that evening, Lucas was waiting by the door. "Well?" he asked. William knelt and hugged him. "We're still here." Lucas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Annie joined them, quiet but smiling. That night, Lucas wrote his longest entry yet. They ask questions. We answer. They push. We stay. William read it later, alone, and felt a swell of emotion he no longer tried to restrain. He knew the final chapter was coming. Not the end of struggle, but the end of doubt. The decision arrived without ceremony. No press release, no public statement, just an email, brief and formal, confirming that the review had concluded and that no action would be taken. The foundation could continue. The gatherings would remain protected. The concern had been noted and dismissed. William read the message once. Then he closed his laptop and sat very still. It was over. Not the work, not the responsibility, but the fear that he might lose what mattered most. He walked into the sunroom. Lucas and Annie were on the floor, surrounded by paper, crayons, and half-built shapes. The late afternoon light spilled in through the windows, warm and forgiving. Lucas looked up. "Your face isn't frowning," he observed. William smiled. "It doesn't need to today." Annie tilted her head. "Is that good?" "Yes," William said. "It's very good." Lucas stood and walked over slowly, as if afraid the moment might break. "We can keep the quiet place?" William knelt and opened his arms. Lucas stepped into them without hesitation. "Yes," William said softly. "We can." Lucas hugged him tightly, then pulled back and wiped his eyes with his sleeve. He didn't apologize for the tears. Annie smiled, relieved but unsurprised. "I knew they'd see," she said. William looked at her. "How?" Annie shrugged. "Some things are obvious if you stop looking away." That evening, they held one last gathering before winter, not to celebrate, just to sit together. Children arrived with parents who hovered at the edges at first, uncertain. Some stayed, some left, and returned later. No one was rushed. Lucas sat beside a boy who stared at the floor. Annie folded paper nearby. After a while, the boy whispered, "My dad doesn't come home anymore." Lucas nodded. "My mom doesn't either." The boy looked up, startled. They sat in silence after that, but they stayed. William watched from the doorway, aware that this quiet courage was what he had nearly missed by trying to be strong alone. Later that night, after the house had emptied and the lights dimmed, William found Lucas in the garden. The bench was dusted with fallen leaves. The air smelled like cold earth and fading summer. Lucas sat with his notebook open on his lap. "Writing?" William asked. Lucas nodded. "The last page." William sat beside him. Lucas wrote carefully, slowly, as if choosing each word with intention. "When Mom left, I thought everything ended, but Annie came, and Dad stayed. Now I know, love doesn't leave. People do, and sometimes, people come back, in different ways." Lucas closed the notebook. William felt his chest tighten. "Can I keep it forever?" Lucas asked. William smiled. "It's yours." Lucas leaned against him, small and solid and alive. "I don't feel broken anymore," he said quietly. "Just different." William rested his hand on his son's shoulder. "Different doesn't mean less." "I know," Lucas replied. "It just means more room." Across the garden, Annie stood near the fountain, watching the water ripple under the moonlight. Miss Johnson waited a few steps back, giving her space. William joined Annie. "You okay?" he asked. Annie nodded. "Yeah." She hesitated, then added, "I think I understand something now." "What's that?" William asked. "You don't help people to fix them," Annie said. "You help them so they don't feel alone while they're fixing themselves." William smiled. "That might be the wisest thing I've heard in a long time." Annie shrugged, embarrassed. "It just feels true." Winter arrived quietly. Snow dusted the garden. The sunroom grew warmer with blankets and mugs of cocoa. The quiet corner became a room of its own in the city, then another, then another. William did not lead them. He protected them. Lucas returned to school full-time. He still had hard days. He carried his notebook in his backpack, no longer as armor, but as memory. Annie continued to visit. Sometimes they played. Sometimes they said nothing at all. Nothing had to be explained anymore. On the anniversary of his wife's death, William took Lucas to the garden. They placed a small stone at the base of the tree she loved. Lucas held his father's hand. "I miss her," he said. William nodded. "So do I." Lucas looked up. "But I'm not scared anymore." William closed his eyes, breathing in the cold air, the truth of that sentence settling deep in his bones. Neither was he. That night, as snow fell softly outside, William stood by the window and watched Lucas and Annie build something new on the floor. A house, with many doors, all of them open. And for the first time in his life, William Hartman understood that real wealth had nothing to do with what you could protect behind walls. It was what you were willing to open. The lesson of this story is simple but profound. Healing does not begin with power, money, or authority. It begins with presence. Grief cannot be rushed, measured, or judged. And true strength is not found in control but in staying when it is uncomfortable. A child was not saved by solutions, but by being seen, not fixed, but accompanied. The story reminds us that kindness does not need permission, that dignity is not earned by status, and that sometimes the quiet act of staying is more powerful than any grand gesture. In a world that often looks away, choosing to stand beside the vulnerable is how real justice, real family, and real hope are built. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.